I did not expect the day to start with the sound of my office door slamming so hard it rattled the glass in its frame. It was 7 in the morning, the building still mostly empty, and I was alone with the faint hum of the city waking up outside. My desk was covered with files I had carefully arranged into neat stacks, the kind of mindless organization that makes you feel ahead of the day before it even begins. Then she appeared. Eva swept in like a storm wearing heels sharp enough to pierce concrete, her perfume trailing behind her in suffocating waves of expensive sweetness. Her emerald green eyes burned with fury, her perfectly contoured face twisted into something feral. She looked at me as if I were an insect crawling across her dining table. "You will be terminated today," she announced, her voice dripping with venom. For a few seconds, I could not process the words. My brain stuttered the way a car engine misfires on a cold morning. Terminated. Did she just walk into my office uninvited and declare I would lose my job? I stared at her, waiting for some explanation. It came sharp and cruel. "Last night at the charity gala you deliberately disrespected me. When I approached your table, you remained seated like some peasant. Do you know how humiliating that was? Everyone saw it. Everyone saw you mock me." I blinked in disbelief. "Mock you?" She leaned forward, her manicured finger stabbing the air between us. The diamond on her hand caught the fluorescent light and sparkled like it was laughing at me. "My husband will hear about this immediately. Before lunch you will be packing up your little desk and leaving this building. You will not show your face here again." My mouth went dry. For a heartbeat, I could only hear the rush of blood in my ears. I thought of the 3 years I had worked at this company, building the international division from scratch. 3 years of business trips, late-night calls across time zones, weekends spent in boardrooms instead of at family gatherings. 3 years of pouring my knowledge of Mandarin, of Chinese markets, of cultural diplomacy into this company so it could grow. And all of it, every hour, every drop of energy, was about to be undone because the CEO's wife thought I had disrespected her by not standing up fast enough at a gala. The absurdity almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I forced my voice to stay calm. "Eva, I think there's been some mistake." Her lips curled into a sneer so sharp it cut the air. "Do not call me Eva. You will address me as Mrs. Morrison from now on, though not for long since you will not be here to speak to me again." With that, she turned on her heel, her heels striking the floor like a gavel, sealing my sentence. The door slammed behind her, leaving her anger and perfume behind like poison. I sat back down, my hands trembling against the desk. My eyes fell on the files I had spent the last hour organizing. 47 clients in Asia, most of them I had personally courted and signed. I had built trust with them, spoken in their language, navigated their cultural expectations. Those files were not just paper, they were the story of my career. And now they meant nothing. I felt the tears threaten, but I blinked them away. I would not give Evangeline Morrison the satisfaction of seeing me crumble, even in her absence. Minutes later, the door opened again. James Morrison, the CEO, filled the doorway. He looked older than I had ever seen him, his usually steady composure fractured by tension. He closed the door gently, as if the wood itself might break if handled too roughly. "Alana," he said quietly. His voice held something close to regret. "I am sorry about this, truly." I laughed, a bitter sound that did not even feel like it belonged to me. "You are sorry? That's all you have to say. Your wife just barged into my office and destroyed 3 years of my life because I did not stand up quickly enough at a gala. And you are sorry?" His gaze dropped to the carpet, unable to meet mine. "She believes you humiliated her in front of important people. She feels slighted." "Slighted?" I repeated, incredulous. "James, I was sitting at my company's table, having dinner." "That is not an offense. That is not grounds for termination." He sighed heavily, running a hand across his face. "You know how she is. She will not let this go. If I refuse her, it will only make things worse for everyone." Something in me snapped. The anger that had been simmering beneath my panic erupted like a flame. "So let me get this straight. You would rather destroy my career, erase everything I have done for this company, than risk an argument at home?" He flinched but did not deny it. "I'll make sure you get a generous severance. I'll personally write your reference letters. You will land somewhere better, I promise." Better. As if jobs like mine grew on trees. As if I had not bled for every inch of ground I had gained in this company. I looked at him, the man who had once praised me in boardrooms for my cultural insight and negotiation skills, the man who had trusted me with the company's expansion into Asia. And all I saw now was weakness. I wanted to scream. To tell him exactly what his wife really was. But instead I pressed my lips together and inhaled deeply. Because a memory was rising, unbidden, sharp as glass. "Eva." Not Mrs. Morrison. Not the queen who had stormed into my office demanding my head. But Eva, the arrogant student who had sat across from me in a penthouse 8 months earlier, insisting she could become fluent in Mandarin in 6 months. Eva, who had no idea how to say even hello correctly, who had demanded I write everything phonetically so she could parrot the sounds. She had no idea who I really was back then. I had gone by my maiden name on the tutoring profile, styled my hair differently, even worn glasses I did not need. To her, I had been a faceless servant, one more disposable employee in her gallery of hired help. And now, here we were. She thought she had crushed me. She thought this was the end. But she had no idea what I carried. I straightened slowly, the tremor gone from my hands. If you are going to fire me, James, then you need to understand something first. He frowned, caught between confusion and caution. Alana, please. No. My voice was sharp, steady. You need to know the truth about your wife and her so-called fluency in Mandarin. His eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I turned to my computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I pulled up a folder I had kept locked for months. Recordings of lessons, clips I had saved for reference. Without hesitation, I clicked forward and sent them directly to his inbox. Check your email, I said softly, my voice calm now. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and then froze. I watched his face drain of color as the video began to play. His wife's voice filled the air. Nai hao, nai hao. Wait, which tone is this again? Just write it in English letters, please. I do not care about the characters, make it easy. She laughed nervously on the recording. If anyone asks me something I do not understand, I will just smile. They will not know the difference. James stared at the screen, horror etched across his features. I folded my arms, the weight of months of humiliation and silence finally lifted. Your wife is not fluent. She is not capable of leading any negotiation in Mandarin. She has been lying to you. I know because I was the one tutoring her in secret for months. I wrote her presentations word for word. She has been living in a fantasy built on my work, and now she has destroyed my career to protect her pride. The silence between us was so heavy I could almost hear the walls of the office breathing. James finally looked up at me, eyes wide, lips parted but no words forming. And for the first time since she stormed into my office, I felt the power shift. This was not the end. This was the beginning. James lowered his phone as if it had suddenly turned to ice in his hand. For several long seconds he said nothing, his eyes darting between me and the glowing screen. The silence stretched until I almost pitied him. Almost. How long, he finally asked, his voice hoarse, has this been going on? 8 months, I answered without hesitation. She hired me through a private tutoring service. Anonymous profiles, confidentiality agreements, all of it. She wanted to become conversational in Mandarin within half a year. She could barely say hello when we started. She still can barely say it now. He shook his head slowly, disbelief clouding his features. She told me she had studied for years. She told the entire board she was ready to lead negotiations. She has been presenting herself as an expert. I gave him a flat look. She memorized scripts. Scripts, I wrote. Every word she speaks in Mandarin is something I fed her. Without me, she cannot even order a cup of tea. His lips pressed into a thin line. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, peering down into a void he did not want to see. You should have told me sooner, he whispered. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Told you? James, I was her tutor, not her handler. Confidentiality was part of the agreement, and until last night, I had no idea she was your wife. Even when I found out, I was prepared to keep her secret. That is what professionals do. But she walked into my office this morning, destroyed my career, and forced my hand. If she wanted silence, she should not have lit the match herself. His jaw clenched. I could see the conflict in him, the war between loyalty to his wife and the ugly truth now laid bare in his inbox. This presentation, he murmured, almost to himself. The investors from Shanghai arrive in 3 days. She is supposed to lead the meeting. I leaned against my desk, arms crossed. Then you should prepare yourself, because unless someone steps in, your wife will collapse under the first unscripted question they throw at her. She has built her fantasy house on sand, and the tide is coming in fast. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand to stop him. I had no interest in defending myself anymore. Not to him, not to her. Do what you need to do, James, I said quietly. Fire me if you must. I will leave this building today and never come back. But do not pretend you are doing it for the good of the company. You are doing it to keep the peace in your house, and the cost will be far higher than one employee's career. I picked up the last of my personal belongings, slipped them into a bag, and walked toward the door. My heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing in the stillness of his office. At the threshold, I paused and glanced back. One more thing, I added, my voice steady. Those investors you are about to host, I know them. I have worked with them for years. They respect me, trust me, and expect to be treated with cultural intelligence. They will not tolerate being deceived. And when your wife tries to charm them with rehearsed gibberish, they will see through her in minutes. You might want to think about how that embarrassment will play out in the boardroom. Then I stepped into the hall and closed the door behind me with a soft click. For a few moments, I just stood there, breathing. The adrenaline had left my veins buzzing, but underneath it all there was something else. Not fear, not even despair anymore. It was clarity. Eva thought she had won. She thought she could erase me with a single tantrum. But in trying to crush me, she had exposed herself. I walked down the corridor past the frosted glass doors of conference rooms I had once led with pride. Colleagues glanced at me curiously as I passed, sensing something had gone wrong but too polite or too afraid to ask. I smiled at them, a brittle smile that hid the storm raging beneath the surface. The elevator doors slid open with their usual quiet chime. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the numbers tick down. With each floor, the weight of the last 3 years settled heavier on my chest. I remembered the late nights at this office, sipping bitter coffee while reviewing contracts in Mandarin. I remembered the first time I closed a multi-million-dollar deal with a Beijing manufacturer, the thrill of earning their respect, not as some token liaison, but as a genuine partner who spoke their language and understood their culture. I remembered the pride of building something from nothing, of turning a forgotten international division into a thriving cornerstone of the company. And now, because one woman felt slighted at a gala, it was gone. The lobby greeted me with its sleek marble floors and towering glass windows. I walked out into the morning air, crisp and cool, carrying only my bag and the fragile dignity I refused to surrender. For the rest of the day, my phone would not stop buzzing. Messages from colleagues asking if the rumors were true, emails from HR about severance details, calls from numbers I did not recognize that went straight to voicemail. By the time I sat in my apartment that evening, staring at the skyline outside my window, exhaustion had sunk into my bones. Yet sleep refused to come. My mind replayed the morning over and over, the fury in Eva's eyes, the resignation in James's, the sound of the door slamming behind me. It should have felt like an ending. But instead, it felt like a door opening. Because beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, I felt something stronger taking root. A spark of defiance, a hunger for justice. Eva thought she had silenced me. She had no idea she had only given me a voice. And if she believed this was the last she would see of me, she was gravely mistaken. This was only the beginning of a story she could not control. When I finally closed my eyes that night after the firing, I did not dream. Instead, memories rose up like smoke, vivid and relentless, dragging me back 8 months earlier, to the moment this entire mess had truly begun. At the time, I had been balancing more weight on my shoulders than I cared to admit. My salary at the firm was decent, yes, but not enough to keep pace with the mountain of student loans I had carried since graduate school. International business degrees are not cheap, and my years in Beijing studying Mandarin had left me with experiences richer than gold, but debts that gnawed at me every month. So I did what many young professionals do when ambition outpaces their paycheck. I looked for side work. It was a quiet Saturday when I stumbled across a tutoring platform called Elite Academic Services. Their listings were not the usual help me with algebra sort of requests. No, this was a site designed for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of people who treated tutors the way they treated personal chefs or private yoga instructors. Discreet, expensive, disposable. One post caught my eye: intensive Mandarin lessons twice a week at a private residence. Payment, $300 per session. Requirements: complete confidentiality, professional demeanor, absolute discretion. I remember staring at the ad for a long time. It reeked of entitlement, but $300 a session was hard to ignore. That kind of money could cover a month of loan payments in less than 2 weeks. I applied under my maiden name, Alana Morgan. Not Banks, not the name connected to my corporate ID badge. I changed my hairstyle, dug out a pair of glasses I didn't really need, and swapped my usual fitted suits for plain conservative outfits. It felt like stepping into a disguise. A new identity I wore like armor. The address listed in the posting was in the most exclusive part of the city. When the taxi pulled up in front of a gleaming glass tower, I actually hesitated. The building seemed to rise endlessly into the clouds, each floor reflecting the city's skyline like a mirror. The doorman gave me a look that lingered on my cheap bag before buzzing me through. The penthouse was something out of a movie. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors that gleamed like water, furniture that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. I stood there, clutching my teaching materials, wondering if I'd wandered into the wrong life. And then she appeared. She introduced herself simply as Eva. No last name, no warmth in her tone. She swept into the room in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire monthly rent, her hair glossy and styled to perfection. "You're here to teach me Mandarin," she said flatly, not even offering a hello. "I need to be conversational in 6 months, not just greetings. I need to negotiate contracts, attend meetings, and sound sophisticated. Can you do that, or should I find someone else?" Her arrogance hit me like a slap. I swallowed my pride and nodded politely. "Of course." "What is your current level?" She waved a dismissive hand. "I know some words, let's just start." Within 10 minutes, I realized she knew almost nothing. Her tones were all wrong, her grammar non-existent. She became irritated when I corrected her, her lips tightening into a thin line. But there was determination in her, too. She refused to stop, even as frustration colored her cheeks. For every mistake she made, she demanded I drill her again. I left that first lesson with my ears ringing from her sharp tone and my pride aching from the way she had treated me. But I also left with 6 crisp $100 bills tucked into my notebook. Money, I told myself, just think about the money. The weeks blurred into a rhythm. Twice a week I slipped into that penthouse wearing my borrowed disguise. Twice a week I endured her commands. "Bring me coffee next time. Use the service entrance from now on. Do not let the doorman see you." Every time, I forced a polite smile and swallowed my irritation. $600 a week was worth a bruised ego. But slowly, almost against my will, I learned more about Eva. She was chasing something bigger than just conversational Mandarin. She bragged constantly about a business venture in the works, a deal of a lifetime involving Chinese investors and $50 million. "My husband thinks I am naturally talented with languages," she said one evening, smirking over her glass of wine. "He has no idea how business really works. Everyone at the club is so impressed when I drop Mandarin phrases. They believe I am some kind of prodigy." I forced a neutral smile, though inside, bile rose in my throat. She was playing at being the very thing I actually was. While I spent my days building international deals from the ground up, she spent her evenings practicing lines she did not understand, fooling people with smoke and mirrors. It should have been laughable, but somehow it was. Somehow it felt dangerous. And then came the hints. There were moments when she let things slip. Casual references to board members, the way she spoke about my husband's influence, or what the company owes me. She never named names, but she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the world bent to her will. The more she revealed, the heavier the unease in my stomach grew. I didn't know exactly who Eva was, not yet, but I knew she was more than just another spoiled socialite. She was connected, powerful, and absolutely desperate to prove herself. And desperation, I knew, could be dangerous. The weeks turned into months, and the strange dual life I was leading became almost routine. By day, I was Alana Banks, senior associate in international business development, working with clients across Asia and building strategies that actually moved millions. By night, I was Alana Morgan, tutor for hire, sitting in a penthouse with a woman who believed parroting tones she did not understand could transform her into a global negotiator. It was surreal, switching between those identities, walking through the revolving doors of my corporate office in the morning with confidence, then sneaking through the service entrance of her building in the evening as if I were smuggling myself into a forbidden world. Eva never changed. She was always demanding, always convinced she could bend the rules of language and culture with sheer force of will. She hated when I corrected her, snapping that I was being too picky, that no one would notice if she missed a tone or used the wrong measure word. She once threw her pen across the room in frustration, the expensive metal clattering against the marble floor. "You are supposed to make me sound sophisticated," she snapped. "Not like a child babbling in kindergarten." I inhaled slowly and reminded myself of the numbers. $600 a week, $2,400 a month, nearly $30,000 a year if I kept it up. Money that meant a chance to breathe, a chance to get out from under the crushing weight of my loans. So I stayed. And as much as I hated her arrogance, I could not deny her determination. She practiced relentlessly, reciting my phonetic notes for hours until she could deliver lines with the confidence of an actress on stage. It was performance, not fluency, but she did not care. For her, image was everything. Sometimes, when she was exhausted, her mask slipped. She would lean back in her chair, rub her temples, and mutter things I wasn't supposed to hear. "They think I am just a wife. They think I sit at home and plan parties. I will show them. I will show them all." Her words lingered in the air long after she spoke them. I remember one evening in particular. She had been practicing a business presentation, stumbling over phrases about market expansion and supply chain logistics. She was visibly frustrated, sweat beading at her temples despite the cool air. Finally, she slammed her notebook shut and looked at me with eyes that for once weren't just arrogant, they were desperate. "Do you think I am stupid?" she demanded. I blinked, caught off guard. "No, Mandarin is one of the hardest languages in the world. Most people take years to. I don't have years." She exploded, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "This presentation is everything. My chance to prove that I am not just a trophy wife. You have to make this work, Alana, you have to." It was the first time I saw her truly vulnerable, the cracks in her perfect armor. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Beneath all the wealth and power, she was still just a woman desperate to be taken seriously. So I promised her I would help. I rewrote her entire presentation into phonetic Mandarin. I coached her on cultural etiquette, down to how deep to bow, how long to hold eye contact, when to pour tea. I built her a persona, piece by piece, that she could wear like a costume, and she began to treat me differently, not with respect, not quite, but with a softer edge. She started offering me drinks when I arrived, asking questions about my background. Once she even said please. "You're very good at this," she admitted one evening, her voice reluctant, like the words tasted bitter on her tongue. "Where did you learn to speak so fluently?" I told her about my years in Beijing, about studying international business and working in markets most Westerners barely understood. I was careful not to mention my job or anything that might connect me to my real identity. She nodded, though I could see in her eyes she still thought of me as an employee, a tool. "Impressive," she said, then smirked. "You should consider working for a real company instead of just tutoring." If only she had known. By the time we reached the final weeks before her big presentation, she was reciting her lines flawlessly, hitting every note I had drilled into her. She was nowhere near fluent, but she had become a convincing actress. She even bragged that soon, she would be the one leading multi-million-dollar deals, impressing board members, and showing her husband she could stand as his equal. That was when the unease inside me grew heavier. Because the way she spoke of it, this was not just about pride or appearances. She wasn't learning Mandarin to make small talk at cocktail parties. She was building a weapon, a performance polished enough to convince powerful men that she belonged at the table with them, and she would use me to sharpen it. The final hint came 2 weeks before the gala. She mentioned casually, as she flipped through her notes, that the investors she would be presenting to were tied to her husband's company. "My husband thinks I am perfect for this role," she said with a gleam in her eye. "He believes in me, and once I deliver this deal, everyone will believe too. They will not be able to ignore me anymore." The words sank like stones in my stomach. Her husband, investors, a deal that could reshape the company's future. I didn't know the full picture yet. I didn't know the name of the man she was married to or how deep her ambitions ran. But I knew enough to understand this wasn't just another spoiled socialite pretending to be something she was. Eva was plotting something bigger, and I had unknowingly helped her build the mask she planned to wear. The closer we crept toward the presentation date, the more Eva transformed. At first, she had been insecure, snapping at me to hide her fear of failure. But now, armed with the scripts I had painstakingly crafted, she began to glow with a new, dangerous confidence. I could see it in the way she carried herself during lessons. She no longer hunched over her notes with worry. She paced the room like a performer rehearsing for an audience. She tossed Mandarin phrases into casual conversation, even when they made no sense, rolling the words off her tongue like they were jewels meant to dazzle. "Do you hear that?" she asked one evening, beaming as she pronounced a phrase about shipping containers completely out of context. "It sounds authentic, doesn't it? My friends at the club are so impressed when I drop this into conversation. They think I've been studying for years." I forced a polite nod, though inside I was choking on the irony. Authentic? She still could not form a single original sentence. She was an actress memorizing lines, not a speaker, yet her ego thrived on the illusion. Each lesson became less about learning and more about performance. She demanded I write her speeches phonetically, down to the syllable, and coached her on gestures, tone, and pauses. I built her stage. She played the star, and she flaunted it everywhere. She told me how she had corrected a waiter at a restaurant who dared mispronounce a dish in Mandarin, even though she had no idea what the dish actually was. She bragged about slipping lines into conversation at charity luncheons where her peers gasped in admiration. "My husband says I sound like a native," she said one evening, smirking over the rim of her wineglass. "He thinks I have a gift. He tells everyone at the company that I'll be handling the next big expansion deal. Can you imagine me, the face of international growth?" I bit my tongue until it hurt. I wanted to tell her that her husband's faith was built on lies. That no matter how much polish I applied, she was still a fraud. But the money kept my mouth shut. And yet, beneath my silence, dread began to bloom, because I knew the investors she was preparing to meet. I knew their expectations, their sharp eyes, their ability to sniff out dishonesty in a heartbeat. I had worked with people like them for years. They were not dazzled by surface-level charm. They respected competence, cultural fluency, the subtle dance of business etiquette that went far beyond rehearsed scripts. Eva was walking into a battlefield armed with cardboard armor, but she did not see it that way. To her, every successful rehearsal was proof of her brilliance. Every gasp of admiration at a cocktail party was validation that she was destined to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men who ran the company. One evening, as I packed up my notes, she leaned back against the couch and watched me carefully. "You know," she said, her voice lighter than usual, "I don't think you realize how important you are to me. Without you, I couldn't do this. You've built something for me, Alana, something no one can take away." The words stung, because even as she thanked me, I knew the truth. She would take my work and claim it as her own, and when the applause came, it would be hers alone. I forced a smile. "I'm glad I could help." She tilted her head, studying me. "You're clever. You should be careful, though. People like you are useful until they're not." A chill crawled down my spine at the warning. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining malice where there was none. But her tone lingered in my ears long after I left the penthouse. The deception spread beyond our lessons. I began hearing whispers at the office. Colleagues mentioned that Mrs. Morrison, yes, they called her that, though I still hadn't connected the dots, was dazzling people with her language skills. Board members were talking about her brilliance, her supposed fluency, her promise as an asset to the company. I kept my head down, swallowing the bitter taste of recognition. They were praising her for knowledge I had built. They were celebrating a lie, blind to the truth that the woman they admired could not string together even the simplest sentence without my scripts. One night, weeks before the gala, she practiced her full presentation for me. She stood at the front of the room, her voice smooth, her pronunciation almost perfect. She moved her hands with the grace I had taught her, paused at all the right moments, smiled in the rehearsed ways I had drilled into her. If you had walked into that room, you would have believed her. When she finished, she looked at me with a triumphant gleam. "I told you I could do it. They're going to love me." I clapped politely, my heart heavy with dread, because she wasn't wrong. She could fool people, maybe even for a while, but she couldn't fool everyone, not forever. And deep down, I knew the moment of truth was coming. By the time autumn rolled around, Eva was no longer just rehearsing. She was performing at every opportunity. Her social circle became her stage. At luncheons, she would sprinkle in rehearsed phrases, watching the awe ripple across the table like she was some prodigy who had mastered the hardest language in the world on a whim. At charity events, she introduced herself to anyone with a Chinese surname, dropping lines that sounded smooth but carried no meaning. Her friends clapped, her husband praised her, and she basked in the applause as if it were oxygen. And I, her invisible architect, sat in the shadows, biting my tongue until it bled. Every week she demanded more scripts, more idioms she could flaunt at parties, more cultural tidbits to drop like breadcrumbs that would make her sound worldly and wise. I gave them to her, not because I respected her, but because I knew what I was dealing with. She wasn't just a spoiled woman looking to impress her friends. She was building an image brick by brick, a persona strong enough to convince investors, board members, and even her own husband that she deserved to stand in the halls of power. And I was the one crafting that image. I should have walked away. I should have said enough when she crossed the line from arrogance into delusion. But the money kept me tethered, and a darker part of me wanted to see how far she would go. One lesson, she strutted across the room, balancing her wineglass like a scepter. "My husband thinks I am a natural," she bragged. "He says I sound better than his executives. Can you believe that? Soon they'll have no choice but to respect me. I'll be sitting at the table, not just smiling from the sidelines." I forced a nod, but inside, alarm bells rang louder than ever. Her goal wasn't just to impress. She wanted power. She wanted influence. She wanted to use the mask I had given her to step into a role she hadn't earned, and she was so certain she could pull it off. 2 weeks before the gala, she finally delivered her entire pitch without faltering. She bowed at the right moments, hit the phonetic pronunciations I had drilled into her, and delivered the performance of her life. When she finished, she turned to me with flushed cheeks and shining eyes. "I'm going to be magnificent," she declared. "Those investors won't know what hit them. This deal will change everything." I smiled tightly, gathering my notes. "You've worked hard. I'm sure it will go well." She smirked. "Of course it will. Do you know what else? This weekend we're attending the Children's Hospital Gala. The most important people in the city will be there. I'll finally get to show off what I've learned in public." The words froze me mid-step. The Children's Hospital Gala. My company was a major sponsor of that event. Our international division always had a corporate table near the front. I was scheduled to attend, to represent the very work I had built. And now she was telling me she would be there too, shimmering in her designer gown, eager to parade the language I had taught her. I felt my chest tight. What were the odds? Hundreds of attendees, dozens of tables. Maybe she wouldn't even notice me. After all, she only knew me as Alana Morgan, the quiet tutor with glasses and plain clothes. I would be Alana Banks that night, dressed for the gala, my hair swept up, my disguise left behind. She wouldn't recognize me, or so I told myself. But doubt gnawed at me, because Eva had a way of sniffing out the smallest slight and turning it into a declaration of war. If she saw me, if she even sensed something familiar, the fragile balance I had been walking would shatter. The days leading up to the gala were filled with unease. At work, I pushed through meetings with clients, my voice steady even as my stomach knotted. At night, I sat across from her while she rehearsed, watching the fantasy she had built grow taller and taller, like a tower of glass that would eventually collapse under its own weight. I told myself I was ready, that no matter what happened at that gala, I had done my job. I had given her the tools, and if she wanted to live or die by them, that was her choice. But deep down, I knew better. I knew I was walking into a storm I could not avoid. The night before the gala, she sat back with a satisfied sigh after delivering her final rehearsal. "They're going to adore me," she said, her eyes gleaming. "This is the beginning of everything. After this, no one will ever dare underestimate me again." Her confidence filled the room like smoke, and I, the one who had lit the match, could only sit there and wonder how much of me would burn with her when it all came crashing down. The night of the gala arrived draped in glitter and nerves. The Children's Hospital Gala was the kind of event that graced magazine covers, a spectacle of wealth disguised as philanthropy. Guests arrived in limousines that lined the circular drive of the Grand Regency Hotel, photographers flashing as gowns swept across marble steps. I had been to the gala twice before, but never as anything more than a corporate representative. My role was simple: smile, shake hands, and embody the competence of the international division I had built. This year was no different. At least, that was what I told myself as I slipped into the black silk gown I had chosen days earlier. The fabric hugged me just enough to feel elegant, but not ostentatious. My hair was pinned into a careful updo, and I wore contact lenses instead of the glasses I used in my tutoring disguise. In the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. Alana Morgan would never have been invited to this ballroom. Tonight, I was Alana Banks again, polished and professional, standing tall in heels that clicked with purpose. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, golden lights spilling across tables draped in white linen and crowned with floral arrangements. Waiters glided past with silver trays, and the air buzzed with laughter, greetings, the clink of champagne glasses. Our company's table was near the front, close enough to the stage that the CEO and his board could bask in the spotlight. I sat with senior management, smiling at spouses and answering polite questions about my work. I played my role well, though every time I lifted my eyes to scan the room, my stomach tightened. And then I saw her. Eva Evangeline Morrison stood at the center of the most prestigious table in the room, her silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers. Diamonds glittered at her neck, her laughter rang like bells, and every eye near her seemed drawn to her light. She gestured as she spoke, her hands painting grand pictures in the air. Even across the room I could feel her intoxicating need to be admired. My heart stuttered. There she was, the woman who believed I was nothing more than her private tutor, now revealed in her full power as the wife of my CEO. The breath caught in my throat. Until that moment, I had not fully allowed myself to believe it. I had known she was connected, yes, that she was more than just a rich socialite. But seeing her there, her hand resting possessively on James Morrison's arm, the truth struck me with the weight of a hammer. Eva, my arrogant student. Eva, the woman I had shaped into a counterfeit expert. Eva, the very reason my division was thriving, and the reason it could crumble. She was my boss's wife. I forced my hands into my lap to still the trembling. I prayed she wouldn't notice me. After all, how could she? Tonight I was not the dowdy tutor with glasses and plain cardigans. I was the professional face of the company. Different hair, different clothes, a different woman entirely. Surely she would not connect the two. The night unfolded in waves of speeches and toasts, laughter rising above the music. I nodded through conversations, my ears buzzing with the knowledge of her presence just yards away. I caught glimpses of her across the room, smiling that triumphant smile, her lips moving in lines I knew I had written for her. Every word, every gesture, every phrase she used to dazzle her circle had passed first through my hands. I was the invisible ghost standing in her shadow. Halfway through dinner, as the servers whisked away the main course, I dared to believe I had survived the evening unnoticed. My disguise had held, my mask remained intact. All I had to do was make it through dessert, shake a few more hands, and I could slip away into the night. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. I excused myself to the restroom, weaving through the tables with my head down. As I returned, the crowd parted, and suddenly she was there, gliding across the floor in my direction. Eva's silver gown shimmered, her emerald eyes scanning the room. She was heading to greet someone at a table near mine, and our paths would cross in seconds. Panic tightened my chest. I quickened my pace, slid into my chair, and fixed my eyes on my dessert plate as though it held the secrets of the universe. Please, I prayed, just keep walking. Then I heard it. Alana, one of my colleagues called from across the table, waving his hand. Did you hear what I said? My head jerked up instinctively, my name already on my lips, and that was when our eyes met. For 2 seconds, 2 long, searing seconds, Eva's gaze locked on mine. Confusion flickered across her face, the kind of flicker you see when you recognize someone but can't place where from. Her lips parted slightly, as though a memory teased the edge of her mind. Then the moment passed. She blinked, smoothed her expression, and continued walking. I released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief washed over me like cold water. She hadn't placed me. I was safe, or so I thought. I spent the rest of the night in a haze, my smile brittle, my laughter forced. I avoided looking toward her table, avoided any chance of another collision. When the final toast was made and the orchestra began to play, I slipped out into the cool night air with my heart still pounding. I thought it was over, but the storm had only just begun. The following morning, I awoke with a throbbing ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes not from wine but from tension held too tightly for too long. The gala had been a blur of lights and chatter, and though I had escaped without confrontation, the memory of Eva's gaze lingered like a shadow. She had looked at me. Not just looked but seen me. The flicker of recognition had been brief, but it was enough to gnaw at my mind. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. After all, I had spent months sitting across from her disguised as someone else. The glasses, the hair, the muted clothes, all of it had been part of the mask I wore as Alana Morgan. Last night, I had been someone entirely different, polished, confident, surrounded by colleagues who knew me only as Alana Banks. She couldn't possibly connect the two, could she? I spent the day at the office in a fog of distraction, nodding through meetings, pretending to take notes. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from coworkers about the success of the gala, how elegant it had been, how dazzling Mrs. Morrison had looked in her silver gown. Each mention of her name sent a fresh wave of unease crashing over me. That evening, as I left the office, a text arrived from an unknown number. Be at the penthouse tomorrow at 6. We need to talk. My breath caught. I hadn't heard from her since the gala. Our last official session had been days before, when she had declared herself ready for the investors. I had assumed, foolishly, that our arrangement was complete, that the gala had been her final test, the closing of the strange chapter we had shared. But now she was calling me back. Against my better judgment, I went. The elevator hummed as it carried me upward, my reflection pale in the mirrored walls. My palms were damp, my heart a drumbeat of dread. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Eva was waiting. She stood near the window, her silver gown replaced by a sharp tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. The glamour of the gala was gone. In its place was something harder, sharper, dangerous. You didn't tell me, she said without preamble, her voice low and cutting. I frowned. Tell you what? Her eyes narrowed. That you work at my husband's company. That you sit in meetings with him, that you're not just some anonymous tutor I plucked off a website. The blood drained from my face. She had figured it out. Somehow, despite my disguise, despite the careful separation of my two lives, she had pieced it together. I never lied to you, I said carefully. You never asked who I was outside of our lessons. You wanted confidentiality. I respected that. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I didn't notice the way you looked at me last night? You knew exactly who I was all along, didn't you? You've been playing me. I took a step forward, palms raised. Eva, listen to me. I didn't know until recently, and even when I realized, don't say my name, she snapped, her voice rising. You don't get to say my name like we're equals. Her fury crackled in the air, electric and volatile. You think you're clever, sitting there with your perfect Mandarin and your smug little corrections, she hissed. But you're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. My husband listens to me, not you. The board listens to me. The investors will listen to me. And when this deal goes through, no one will remember your name. Her words cut deep, but I held my ground. You don't understand, Eva. Those investors aren't going to be fooled forever. They will expect fluency, not performance. And when they realize, enough, she shouted, slamming her hand against the glass table. The sound rang like a gunshot. I will not let you ruin this for me. I worked too hard. I sacrificed too much. I will not let some second-rate employee stand in my way. Her eyes burned into mine, wild and desperate. For the first time, I saw not arrogance, but fear. The fear of a woman who had built her entire identity on a fragile lie and was terrified of it crumbling. That was when I understood. She wasn't just protecting her image. She was protecting her place beside James, her foothold in the company, her claim to power. And to her, I wasn't just a tutor. I was a threat. The next day, she acted. By the time I arrived at the office, the whispers had already begun. HR emails stacked in my inbox, vague and polite but heavy with finality. My keycard no longer opened the main entrance. When I reached my desk, my belongings had been boxed. And then came the summons, James Morrison's office now. I walked the corridor in silence, my heels clicking like gunfire against the polished floor. Every step felt like walking toward a verdict I had never asked for. When I opened the door, Eva was there, standing beside him. Her hand rested delicately on his arm, her eyes glinting with triumph. She had done it. She had painted me as the villain, the liar, the threat. And James, torn between truth and loyalty, had chosen her. It was the beginning of my downfall, and though I didn't know it yet, it was also the spark of my revenge. When the door to James Morrison's office clicked shut behind me that day, I told myself it was the end. The end of my career, the end of my place at the company, the end of everything I had built from the ground up. But endings are funny things. Sometimes, they are just beginnings in disguise. The days that followed my firing blurred together in a fog of disbelief. One moment I had been the rising star of the international division, the one executives trusted to negotiate with foreign partners. The next, I was unemployed, my desk cleared, my reputation quietly dismantled by whispers seeded from Eva's lips. I stayed inside my apartment for 3 days, blinds drawn, phone silenced. I drifted between the couch and my bed, replaying every scene in my head, every word Eva had hurled at me. The humiliation clung to my skin like ash. But grief has its limits. After 3 days, something inside me shifted. It was as if the fog lifted, leaving behind not despair but clarity. A sharp, cold clarity that hummed with purpose. I wasn't finished. Eva thought she had erased me with one vicious strike. She thought I would disappear quietly, too humiliated to fight back. But she had underestimated the one thing that had carried me this far, my refusal to accept defeat. And if I had lost my place in the company, I would find another way to win. The first step was silence. I didn't announce my firing to friends or colleagues. I didn't post a vague statement online or seek pity. I stayed quiet, listening, watching, waiting. Information, I had learned, was more powerful than outrage, and information was exactly what I needed. Within a week, the whispers began to find me. A former colleague called to check in and casually mentioned that the Shanghai investors had arrived earlier than expected. Another sent me an email, unsigned, describing how Eva had been parading her fluency in front of them, dazzling them with polished lines that sounded convincing but shallow. I knew those investors. I had spent years building trust with their network, attending banquets, enduring late nights of karaoke and endless toasts. They were shrewd men and women, polite to a fault but ruthless in business. They valued sincerity, cultural respect, and above all, truth. Eva's mask might hold for an evening, maybe 2, but not forever. The cracks would come, and I would be ready when they did. Still, revenge is not built in a day. I had to be careful, deliberate. If I moved too soon, Eva would spin the story against me again. She had James's loyalty, the board's admiration, and the blind trust of people too dazzled by her performance to question it. So I began to lay the groundwork. I reached out quietly to old contacts, people who trusted me, who had seen me work in Beijing, who knew my fluency wasn't an act. I met them for coffee, for drinks, for casual lunches where I asked pointed questions and listened more than I spoke. One of them, a soft-spoken consultant named Wei Zhang, leaned across the table during one of our meetings and said, "Alana, everyone knows it was you. The investors may be polite to her face, but they know the difference between performance and fluency. They will not be fooled for long." His words settled into me like a spark in dry kindling. Everyone knows. The illusion was already cracking. All I had to do was wait for the moment when the tower Eva had built collapsed under its own weight. But waiting was never my strong suit. Late at night, I sat at my desk, poring over old notes, drafting scenarios, imagining the ways Eva might stumble. I didn't want to simply watch her fail. I wanted to be ready to step into the void her failure would leave behind. If the company saw me as expendable, I would make myself indispensable again. Not with bitterness, not with anger, but with undeniable proof. I told myself this wasn't about revenge. That it was about justice, about restoring what had been stolen from me. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the city outside my window glittered with indifferent light, I admitted the truth. It was about revenge. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smirk, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she stood in James's office and watched me fall. And I promised myself that one day, she would look at me again, not with victory, but with fear. Patience had never been my strength, but in the weeks following my firing, I learned to wear it like armor. I moved quietly through the city, listening more than I spoke, storing away every piece of information that might one day serve me. Eva's performance at the gala had secured her the spotlight, but fame comes with scrutiny. The whispers that reached me painted a picture of a woman desperate to maintain her mask, a woman who had grown reckless in her hunger for validation. I learned that she had begun hosting private dinners with the Shanghai delegation, insisting she could serve as their primary contact. She filled the room with carefully rehearsed phrases and pre-written scripts, dazzling the less discerning attendees. But those who spoke fluent Mandarin, those who understood nuance, left unconvinced. "She recites well," one investor reportedly said after a dinner, "but when the conversation drifts, she vanishes." The words filled me with grim satisfaction. Eva could mimic, but she could not create, and in business, unpredictability was inevitable. Still, I could not simply wait for her collapse. If I wanted to reclaim what she had stolen, I needed more than hope. I needed leverage, so I dug. I combed through old lesson notes, recordings of sessions she had insisted on keeping for practice. I found drafts of her speeches saved in my cloud, marked with her edits, proof of my authorship. I pieced together a paper trail that tied her polished mask directly back to me. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. Possessing those files was one thing, using them was another. To expose her would mean exposing myself, admitting that I had worked for her in secret, that I had blurred the lines between my professional role and a clandestine side job. If I moved recklessly, I could destroy us both. So I began testing the waters. I shared fragments of her errors with Wei Zhang, my consultant contact, framing them as concerns about how the company was being represented. His sharp eyes narrowed as he listened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Alana," he said quietly, "if she continues this path, it will not just embarrass her. It will damage the company's standing with the delegation. They respect honesty, even brutal honesty. They will not forgive deception." He hesitated, then added, "And they will look for someone to blame." That was when it struck me. I didn't need to tear Eva down. She was already building her own downfall. All I had to do was position myself so that when the collapse came, the spotlight shifted naturally onto me. And so I played the long game. I began attending industry mixers, slipping back into circles where my reputation still lingered. I spoke Mandarin freely, not flaunting but demonstrating, letting people remember who I was and what I could do. I didn't mention Eva. I didn't need to. The contrast between us would reveal itself in time. At night, I returned to my files, shaping them into something sharper, cleaner. Not blackmail, not yet, but evidence. Evidence that when the investors began to question Eva's sudden brilliance, the truth would point back to me. Still, a part of me couldn't ignore the danger. Eva wasn't just ambitious, she was ruthless. The way she had looked at me in the penthouse, eyes blazing with fury, had revealed the depth of her fear. If she even suspected I was preparing to rise again, she would strike harder, faster, without hesitation. And that was where the thought first came, maybe I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Because in the quiet corners of conversations, in the pauses of phone calls with old contacts, I sensed something more. A curiosity, a wariness. As if others were watching Eva too, waiting to see how her game would play out. One late evening, as I sat in a cafe reviewing documents, Wei Zhang leaned across the table and lowered his voice. "There are people," he said carefully, "who would prefer Mrs. Morrison's star not rise too high. You may not be as alone in this as you think." The words hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to ask who he meant, what forces might already be aligning against her, but the look in his eyes silenced me. It was not yet time to know, so I filed the thought away, tucking it deep into the quiet fire inside me. Because if others were watching her, if others wanted to see her fall, then when the moment came, I would not be standing in the ashes alone. And that was when I realized, the reckoning wasn't just looming for Eva, it was looming for all of us. The first signs of Eva's unraveling came not with a bang, but with a whisper. 2 weeks after the gala, I received a discreet call from a colleague still inside the company. She didn't say much, just that during a dinner with the Shanghai delegation, Mrs. Morrison had struggled. The word was delivered delicately, but I could hear the weight beneath it. Struggled. It was the very word I had been waiting for. I pressed for details, but my contact hesitated, her voice lowered to a near whisper. She handled the speech fine. Polished, rehearsed. But once they began asking questions, she froze. She had no idea what they were saying. James had to intervene, smooth it over. They laughed politely, but she trailed off. I didn't need her to finish. I already knew how it ended. The investors weren't cruel. They would smile, nod, sip their wine, and make mental notes. They would never humiliate a host in public, but the ledger in their minds had shifted. They had seen the weakness in her mask. And in business, weakness is blood in the water. I thanked my colleague and hung up, my pulse quickening. It was happening. The tower Eva had built was beginning to sway. Still, I stayed patient. Too many times I imagined bursting into the boardroom with my files, tearing down her illusion in one glorious strike. But that would make me reckless, desperate. I couldn't let my need for justice blind me to timing. Instead, I moved like a shadow. I attended networking events where I knew the investors would appear, mingling on the periphery. I didn't seek them out, not directly. That would have been too obvious. But when conversations drifted my way, I let the Mandarin flow naturally, weaving it into anecdotes, stories, casual remarks. I wasn't performing. I was living the language, and I could see it in their eyes, recognition, respect. They knew. They remembered me. One evening, at a small industry reception, I found myself standing near Mr. Chen, one of the delegation's most senior members. He had always been shrewd, polite to the point of inscrutability. I expected nothing more than a nod, but when our eyes met, something flickered there, a memory. "Banks," he said slowly, his Mandarin measured, deliberate. "You negotiated the textile contract 3 years ago, did you not?" I smiled. "Yes, Mr. Chen, it was a pleasure working with your team." He inclined his head, his expression giving nothing away. But the faintest curve of his lips told me he remembered not just the contract, but the woman behind it. That night, as I walked home through the city's glittering streets, I felt the fire in my chest burn brighter. The investors hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't bought Eva's performance wholesale. They knew the difference. And when the moment came, they would choose substance over show. Meanwhile, word of Eva's struggles began to circulate. Quietly, discreetly, but enough. My inbox buzzed with half-coded notes from former colleagues, each one more telling than the last. She panicked when they went off script. She pretended not to hear a question. She asked James to translate, even though the investor had spoken English. It was happening faster than I expected. Her mask was cracking, and every fissure widened under the weight of her ambition. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. Eva was nothing if not resilient. Each stumble only fueled her determination to double down, to claw her way back into control. And sure enough, she began booking more private sessions. Not with me, of course, I was long gone, but with other tutors, other experts, flown in at great expense. She was scrambling, desperate to patch the holes in her performance before the investors lost faith entirely. But language doesn't bend to desperation. It bends only to time, patience, and humility, qualities Eva had never possessed. The breaking point was inevitable, and as I waited for it to arrive, I sharpened my weapons. My files were ready, my evidence airtight. I rehearsed not just what I would say, but how I would say it. calm, professional, unimpeachable. Because when the storm hit, I wasn't going to be the one screaming in fury. I was going to be the one standing in the eye of it, untouched, undeniable. And that thought carried me through the long nights, the restless hours when doubt whispered that maybe she would survive this, maybe she would win. No, her reckoning was coming. And when it did, I would be there to watch her fall. The storm broke on a Thursday. I wasn't in the boardroom when it happened. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the building anymore. But whispers travel fast in corporate halls, faster than official memos, faster even than truth itself. By the end of the day, I had 3 different versions of the story, and each painted the same picture. Eva's mask had finally slipped in front of the very people she had hoped to dazzle. The Shanghai delegation had requested a strategy session, a deep dive into logistics and future partnerships. Eva had insisted on leading it herself, despite James's quiet protests. She walked into that boardroom in a tailored suit, chin high, ready to prove herself once again. The opening went smoothly enough. She delivered her memorized remarks in Mandarin, her voice confident, her pronunciation practiced to near perfection. For a moment, she seemed untouchable. And then the questions began. One investor asked about supply chain resilience in response to tariffs. Another pressed for clarification on a cultural reference she had misused. A third switched effortlessly between Mandarin and English, testing her ability to follow nuance. Eva faltered, stumbled, smiled too brightly, and asked them to repeat. She tried to pivot to rehearsed lines, but they no longer fit the flow of the conversation. Within minutes, the illusion crumbled. James stepped in, smoothing the edges, translating, redirecting. But it was too late. The investors had seen what lay behind the curtain. One account claimed that Mr. Chen, the shrewd elder of the delegation, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Your wife speaks well," he supposedly said in Mandarin, his voice polite but cool. "But does she listen?" The silence that followed was damning. By the time the meeting ended, Eva had managed to salvage her poise, but not her credibility. The investors remained courteous, but their respect had shifted. They had glimpsed the gap between image and substance, and there is no unseeing such a thing. When I heard the story, I felt a rush of satisfaction so sharp it almost hurt. It had begun, but even as triumph stirred in my chest, I forced myself to stay calm. A single stumble would not destroy her. Eva was too resourceful, too ruthless to let one humiliation undo her. She would double down, scheme harder, lash out at anyone she could blame. I needed to be ready. And I wasn't the only one. In the days that followed, quiet ripples spread through the company. People began to question, not loudly, but in hushed tones, whether Eva's fluency had ever been what it seemed. Some chalked it up to nerves. Others weren't so forgiving. I met Wei Zhang for coffee again, and he confirmed what I already suspected. "The delegation respects you," he said simply. "They remember who closed their deals. They know sincerity when they see it." I nodded, heart steady. "But Eva still has James. She still has the board. As long as they protect her, she can survive." Wei's eyes flicked toward me, unreadable. "Even the strongest armor can crack when the inside is hollow." I carried those words with me as I walked home, the city lights glittering overhead. He was right. The mask Eva wore wasn't just cracking, it was rotting from the inside, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. At a networking dinner the following week, I caught whispers from 2 mid-level executives. They spoke in low tones, their eyes darting around the room. "She embarrassed us in front of the delegation. James had to cover for her. She's overreaching. If she keeps this up, she'll sink the entire expansion." Their words were like music. Not because I reveled in her humiliation, though part of me did, but because it meant the tide was shifting. People inside the company were no longer blinded by her glamour. They were questioning, doubting, waiting. The trap was setting itself. All I had to do was step into place. So I kept moving quietly, strategically. I reconnected with old clients, reminding them subtly of my expertise. I offered consulting advice to colleagues off the record, building goodwill. I strengthened ties with the very delegation Eva had failed to impress. I wasn't just waiting for her to fall. I was preparing to rise. And in the still hours of the night, when the city outside my window pulsed with neon light, I felt something stir deep inside me. A certainty I hadn't allowed myself to feel since the day she had stripped me of my career. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was inevitability. Because Eva Morrison had built her empire on lies. And I was the truth waiting to break it apart. The collapse came faster than even I had imagined. In business, reputation is a fragile currency. You can spend years building it, polishing it, feeding it with charm and effort, and yet lose it in the span of a single meeting. Eva had survived her first stumble by sheer force of will, but the cracks had widened. And with every new encounter, every stray question she couldn't answer, every subtle glance from the delegation, her mask fractured further. By midweek, the whispers had grown louder. She doesn't understand what she's saying. She memorizes, but nothing sticks. She's dangerous. She'll ruin the deal. I didn't have to plant those seeds, they grew on their own. All I had to do was watch. And wait. The breaking point came during a formal dinner at the Eastern Trade Association, a gathering designed to finalize terms before the delegation flew home. Eva had insisted on hosting, draping herself in gold silk and rehearsing for hours. She swept into the ballroom on James's arm, radiating confidence, ready to prove once more that she belonged. The opening toast was flawless. The speeches rehearsed. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might pull it off. Then Mr. Chen rose. He was a quiet man, his words always measured, his expression impossible to read. He lifted his glass, spoke a few polite phrases, and then deliberately, casually slipped into an unscripted story. The tale flowed with idioms, humor, cultural nuance. It was the kind of story you could not prepare for, the kind that demanded true fluency to follow. He ended it with a question, his eyes resting squarely on Eva. The room went silent. I wasn't there, but I could imagine it perfectly. Eva's smile tightening, her fingers clenching around her glass, the faint panic in her eyes. She would have laughed too brightly, stammered, maybe even tried to turn to James for rescue. But Mr. Chen would not rescue her. He had set the trap deliberately, and she had walked right into it. By the time the dinner ended, the verdict was clear. The investors remained polite, but their trust had evaporated. They no longer believed in Eva's mask, and that was the night everything shifted. The next morning, I received a call. "Alana," Wei Zhang said simply, his voice calm but urgent. "They want to see you." I froze. "Me? Why?" "Because they know," he replied. "They know you were the one behind her performance. They know you are the one who speaks with substance. They want clarity, and they want it soon." The words sent a jolt through me, part fear, part exhilaration. The moment I had been waiting for was here. The delegation was no longer fooled, no longer interested in the glittering illusion Eva had sold them. They wanted truth. And I was the truth. Still, caution anchored me. If I stepped forward too boldly, Eva would strike again. James might protect her, the board might shield her, and I could find myself crushed between their power and her desperation. But then came the message that changed everything. A formal invitation, delivered through a discreet channel. The investors were hosting a private strategy session, not with the company, not with James, with me. The weight of it settled into my chest like a stone. They weren't just curious, they were making a statement. They were positioning me directly against her. For a long time, I stared at the invitation, my mind racing. This was the opportunity I had dreamed of, the chance to reclaim my career, my reputation, everything Eva had tried to take from me. But it was also dangerous, because stepping into that room meant declaring war, and once declared, there would be no turning back. That night, I stood at my window, the city sprawling below like a glittering map of ambition and ruin. I thought of Eva, her smirk, her triumph, her fury. I thought of James, torn between loyalty and truth. I thought of the investors, patient predators who had waited until the mask cracked before making their move. And for the first time, I wondered if I had underestimated them all, because maybe Eva wasn't the only one playing a game. Maybe I was just another piece on the board. The thought sent a chill through me, but it also hardened my resolve. If they wanted to use me, they would learn I was not a pawn. I was a player, and I was ready to make my move. The strategy session was held in a discreet suite at the Mandarin Oriental, far from the gleaming walls of the company boardroom. No James, no board members, no Eva. Just the Shanghai delegation, a translator on standby who I knew wouldn't be needed, and me. When I walked into that room, I felt the shift immediately. It wasn't the warmth of a polite dinner or the formality of a corporate pitch. It was something sharper, colder, like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. Mr. Chen greeted me with a nod, his eyes unreadable. "Ms. Banks," he said in flawless English, "thank you for coming." I bowed slightly, switching to Mandarin. "It is my honor, Mr. Chen. I am grateful for the opportunity." A faint smile touched his lips. "Good, then let us speak plainly." For the next hour, we did. No scripts, no rehearsed lines, just conversation. They asked about cultural strategy, about supply chain partnerships, about long-term vision for the company's role in China. I answered each question with the ease of someone who had lived and worked within their world, not just studied it from afar. The room softened. Laughter broke the air. Respect flickered in their eyes. And when the session ended, Mr. Chen leaned forward, folding his hands. "We respect your knowledge, Ms. Banks. We respect your honesty. But tell me, why does your company not recognize your value?" The question landed heavy in the room. I hesitated. I could have spoken the truth, told them how Eva had stolen my work, how she had paraded it as her own while I was pushed into the shadows. I could have unleashed the bitterness that still clawed at me, but instead I smiled. "Sometimes, Mr. Chen, people see only what they want to see." His eyes glittered. "And yet here you are." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was enough. When I left the suite, the night air felt electric, alive. I had done it. The investors knew the truth. They had seen behind Eva's mask, and they had seen me standing where she could not. For the first time in months, I felt something close to hope. But hope, I would soon learn, is rarely simple. The next day, the blow came. Word spread like wildfire through the company. The Shanghai delegation had quietly expressed concerns about Mrs. Morrison's role. They had requested new representation moving forward. Eva was furious. She stormed into meetings, demanded explanations, raged at James behind closed doors. But rage could not patch a broken reputation. The board, once dazzled by her glamour, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. And then, the dagger, the investors suggested me by name. The message was clear. They trusted me, not her. When I heard, I thought I would feel triumph. I thought I would taste the sweetness of victory after months of humiliation. But instead, I felt unease, because it was too perfect, too neat. The investors hadn't just uncovered the truth, they had orchestrated the timing. They had waited for Eva to collapse and then lifted me into her place like a piece they had been saving all along. And that's when the real twist revealed itself. It wasn't about Eva. It never had been. Eva was a distraction, a glittering mask the investors had tolerated until it no longer served them. They had humored her, allowed her to play her part, and then discarded her when she stumbled. And me, I was simply the next piece on their board. The fluent, competent, reliable face they could present to the company, to the world. I wasn't the victor of some personal vendetta. I was their choice, their pawn. The realization hit like ice water. I had spent months burning with anger, plotting revenge, waiting to see Eva fall. And now that she had, the triumph wasn't mine, it was theirs. They hadn't rescued me out of loyalty or justice. They had chosen me because it suited their plan. For a moment, I almost laughed. The irony was too sharp, too bitter. Eva and I, enemies locked in battle, had never really been fighting each other. We had been fighting shadows, while the true players pulled the strings from above. Eva lost because she was hollow. I won because I was, but neither of us had ever truly been in control. The final time I saw her, weeks later, was by accident. She was leaving the building as I was arriving, her face pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Gone was the shimmer, the glamour, the triumphant smile. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before. Our eyes met briefly. For a heartbeat, I expected venom. Fury. But instead, what I saw was something closer to recognition. A silent acknowledgement of the war we had waged, and the truth that neither of us had won in the way we imagined. She walked past me without a word, and I stepped into the building, greeted by colleagues who smiled, who whispered my name with respect, who looked to me now as the face of the company's future. I had risen. But as I rode the elevator up, the thought lingered. Rise or fall, pawn or player, maybe the game never really ends.